There's a particular kind of certainty that shows up exactly once or twice in a person's life. Not the confident kind, not the kind built on evidence or experience, just a sudden, bone-deep refusal that arrives before your brain has finished processing what it's refusing. I felt that kind of certainty exactly once, standing in a hospital hallway in 1996, and it's shaped every single year of my life since. I'm 58 years old. My daughter Emily was born on a Tuesday in October, 30 years ago this fall, and something went wrong during delivery that none of us fully understood in the moment. A cord complication, oxygen cut off longer than it should have been. The kind of birth injury doctors describe carefully, clinically, while you're standing there trying to process that the healthy baby you'd been expecting for 9 months had just become something else entirely. The doctor sat Diane and me down 2 days later, Emily still in the NICU, and told us, gently but plainly, that our daughter would likely have significant, permanent disabilities. Cerebral palsy, he said. Given the severity, he recommended we consider, his word, consider placement in a residential care facility once she was stable enough. Said it would be easier on our marriage, our future, whatever other children we might have. Diane and I looked at each other for maybe 2 seconds. Then, without either of us needing to discuss it first, we both said no. The labor itself had seemed ordinary right up until it wasn't. Diane had been in labor 14 hours, further along than expected. The nurses moving with a calm efficiency that gave no early indication anything was going sideways. Then, somewhere in the final stretch, the monitors started telling a different story. Emily's heart rate dropping in a way that sent the room from calm to controlled chaos in about 90 seconds. I remember being pushed back against the wall by a nurse who didn't have time to be polite about it, watching a team of people I'd never met work with, an urgency that told me everything I needed to know before anyone explained a word of it to me. Emily was born blue, silent for the first agonizing seconds, then crying, a real, actual cry that I still remember as the most relieving sound I've ever heard in my life, right up until we learned, over the following days, exactly what those silent seconds had cost her. The oxygen deprivation had been brief, but significant enough to cause real, lasting damage. Nobody used the word cerebral palsy that first day. It took another 48 hours of tests and specialist consultations before we had a name for what we were facing. And one more day after that before a doctor sat us down to talk about what our lives might look like going forward. I want to be honest about something most people probably assume isn't true about that moment in the hallway. Diane and I weren't as certain as our fast, unified no might have suggested. We said no immediately, out of instinct, out of something neither of us could have explained clinically in that moment. But that certainty cracked open plenty of times over the weeks and months that followed, late at night, both of us lying awake, running through every worst-case scenario the doctor had gently outlined for us. A lifetime of intensive care, a marriage strained past breaking, a life neither of us had trained for or chosen. What if we're wrong? Diane asked me once. Maybe 3 weeks in, Emily asleep in the bassinet beside our bed, still needing help with things that should have resolved on their own by then. What if we're doing this because we're too proud to admit we can't handle it? I didn't have a good answer for her. I still don't know if the answer I gave that night was wisdom or just stubbornness dressed up as conviction. I just remember telling her that whatever this turned out to be, we were going to figure it out together, one day at a time, because the alternative, handing our daughter over to strangers because a doctor thought it would be easier, wasn't something either of us could live with, whatever it cost us instead. The first 2 years were the hardest of our entire marriage, harder than either of us had braced for, even with the doctor's warnings ringing in our ears. Emily needed physical therapy 3 times a week, a 90-minute drive each way to the nearest specialist in Bend. She needed feeding support most of that first year, equipment neither of us knew how to use properly at first, appointments that ate up entire days and left us both exhausted in ways new parents aren't supposed to have to be. I remember one night, maybe 8 months in, sitting on our bathroom floor after finally getting Emily down, crying in a way I hadn't let myself do since the hospital. Diane finding me there and just sitting down beside me without saying anything for a long while. "We didn't sign up for this," I finally said, ashamed of the thought, even as I said it out loud. "No," she agreed, quiet. But we didn't sign up for the easy version of anything when we got married either. We just said yes to each other. This is part of that yes now too. We learned everything from scratch that first year. How to position her for feeding, how to do the exercises the therapist showed us, how to read the specific sounds she made before she had words to tell us what she needed. Slow, exhausting, unglamorous work. Nobody prepares you for how much of parenting a child with real disabilities is just relentless, invisible labor most people never see. The school fight started when Emily turned 5, a whole different battle than the medical one, convincing a small-town school district that hadn't dealt with a student quite like her before that she deserved a real education, not just a corner of a classroom to be minded rather than taught. Diane became someone I barely recognized during those years. Fierce in a way she'd never had reason to be before, sitting through IEP meetings with binders full of research, refusing to let anyone in that district treat her daughter as an afterthought. I handled the financial side, picking up every extra electrical job I could find to cover therapies insurance wouldn't touch. Watching my own daughter's medical bills become the defining shape of our family's budget for over a decade. Our marriage strained under all of it more than once. There were years, especially when Emily was young, where Diane and I barely functioned as a couple, both of us so depleted by the daily demands of her care that romance became a luxury neither of us had energy left over for. We fought about money, about exhaustion, about whether we were doing enough, whether we were doing too much, whether we'd made the right call in that hospital hallway all those years back. Neighbors helped where they could. Casseroles, occasional babysitting from people brave enough to learn Emily's routines, a church community that showed up with more consistency than either of us expected going in. It wasn't easy, but it also wasn't as alone as that doctor's grim prediction had implied it would be. Emily's speech developed slowly through years of therapy into something distinctly her own. Not typical, but entirely hers. Expressive in ways that took people time to learn to understand, but that carried real personality once you did. She had opinions about everything from an early age, strong ones, communicated as clearly as her body allowed, and anyone who spent real time with her learned quickly that whatever the doctor's grim prediction had implied, our daughter had a full, vivid inner life that deserved every bit of the fight we'd put up for her. By the time she was a teenager, Emily had built her own small circle of friends at school, kids who'd grown up alongside her long enough to stop noticing her wheelchair, her assistive communication device, the particular way she laughed with her whole body when something struck her as genuinely funny. Diane and I found our footing again somewhere in those years too. Slowly, the crisis mode urgency of Emily's early childhood settling into something more sustainable, more like an actual life instead of a constant emergency. We started dating again in our own house after Emily went to bed. Small, ordinary things that felt like miracles after over a decade of barely surviving each day. I still doubted our decision sometimes, even then. Some 3 a.m. nights, watching Diane sleep after another exhausting day, I'd wonder quietly whether an easier life had been available to us the whole time. One we'd refused out of stubborn pride rather than genuine conviction. The doubt finally quieted for good about 2 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that turned out to mean more than almost any other day of my adult life. Emily, 28 at the time, had been working towards something for over a year. A part-time job at the local library, cataloging returns with an adapted workstation the county had helped fund, something she'd fought for herself, filling out her own application, advocating for her own accommodations with a fierce independence that still takes my breath away when I think about it. Diane and I showed up on her first official day, hovering awkwardly near the entrance, trying not to embarrass her the way parents of adult children with disabilities learn to worry about constantly. Emily wheeled up to her workstation, settled in, and started sorting the return cart with the kind of focused competence that had nothing to do with the fragile infant a doctor had once suggested we hand over to strangers. She caught us watching from the doorway and gave us a look, pointed, unmistakable, the exact expression she'd worn since she was old enough to have opinions. That said, clear as anything her communication device could have spelled out. "I've got this. You can go now." I stood in that library doorway with 30 years of doubt finally settling into something like peace. That doctor had told us, 30 years earlier, that a life like this wasn't possible for her. Here she was, building it herself, one deliberate choice at a time, needing us less every single year in exactly the way any parent should hope their child eventually will. I used to think the proof we'd made the right decision would arrive as some single, dramatic moment, a miraculous recovery, a doctor eating his words, something cinematic enough to finally silence 30 years of quiet doubt. It never came that way. It came instead as 1,000 small, unremarkable moments stacked up over 3 decades. Emily learning to hold a spoon, Emily arguing with a teacher about a grade she thought was unfair, Emily rolling up to a library workstation and doing her job with total competence, needing us there less and less as the years went on. If you're standing in some version of that hospital hallway right now, facing a decision everyone around you seems certain about except you, I can't promise you it'll be easy, or that the doubt will ever fully disappear. What I can tell you is that 30 years later, watching my daughter build a genuinely good life on her own terms, I've never once regretted refusing to let someone else decide on our behalf what that life was allowed to look like. Emily lives about 20 minutes from us now, in a small, accessible apartment she manages mostly independently, with support services stopping by a few times a week for the things she still needs help with. She still works at the library twice a week. She has a boyfriend, Marcus, who Diane and I adore, who treats her exactly like the capable, opinionated woman she is, rather than a fragile thing to be managed. Diane and I are closer now than we've probably been since our first year of marriage, the crisis decades behind us, replaced by something steadier. Sunday dinners with Emily, ordinary conversations about her job, her relationship, her plans, none of the grim predictions from that hospital hallway anywhere in sight. We still think about that doctor sometimes, not with anger exactly. He was working from what he genuinely believed at the time, limited by an outdated understanding of what people like Emily were capable of building. I hope, wherever he ended up in his career, he eventually met other families who proved him wrong, the same way we did. I drove past that same hospital last month, dropping off paperwork for a minor procedure Diane needed, and found myself sitting in the parking lot a while longer than necessary, thinking about a hallway inside those walls 30 years back. Two terrified young parents saying no to a future somebody else had already written for their daughter without asking either of them first. I don't know exactly what made us both certain enough in that specific moment to refuse an expert's confident recommendation. I've stopped needing a clean answer for it. I just know that certainty turned out to be right. 30 years and 1,000 hard days later, standing in a library doorway, watching my daughter do a job she'd fought to earn entirely on her own. Emily called me that same evening, her voice coming through her device in the particular rhythm I've learned to understand as easily as any other language, telling me about her day. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary update from an ordinary life she built for herself, against every prediction that once said it wasn't possible. We said no once, 30 years ago, in a hallway that still occasionally visits my dreams. I've never once wished we'd said anything else.